When the HSS Nautilus emerged from the quantum fold, the reaction from the Galactic Assembly's defense fleet was immediate and predictable. Panic. Captain Sarah Chen watched through the bridge's panoramic viewport as sleek, crystalline ships scattered like startled fish, their engines flaring bright against the backdrop of stars. "They're hailing us," Lieutenant Marcus Webb announced from his communications station, trying and failing to hide his amusement. "The Exarillion Command wants to know if we're experiencing a catastrophic systems failure. They're offering emergency assistance." Sarah smoothed down her midnight blue uniform, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The Nautilus must have been quite a sight to the Assembly's standardized fleet, a massive vessel that seemed to have more in common with Earth's deep-sea creatures than their sterile spacecraft. The ship's biomechanical hull rippled with iridescent patterns, its surface covered in what appeared to be scales that shifted and flowed like liquid metal. "Inform them that we're perfectly fine," Sarah replied. "This is simply how our ship looks. Transmit our diplomatic credentials." The Nautilus had been humanity's greatest achievement in spacecraft design, though not a single alien race would understand why. Not yet. While the rest of the galaxy had pursued perfectly geometric shapes and crystalline structures, humanity had turned to nature for inspiration. The ship's hull was composed of millions of individual scales, each capable of adapting its structure at the molecular level. The vessel didn't just travel through space. It swam through it, reading and responding to quantum currents that other ships couldn't even detect. As they approached the Galactic Assembly Central Station, a massive structure of interlocking crystalline rings that sparkled like a diamond in space, Sarah could see the gathered diplomatic vessels. Each one seemed to be trying to outdo the others in terms of geometric precision and symmetry. The Exarillion ships were perfect spheres of pure crystal. The Aetherian vessels were collections of interconnected triangles that caught and reflected starlight, and the Volturi craft were sleek needles that appeared to pierce space itself. The Nautilus, in comparison, looked like it had swum up from the depths of Earth's oceans. Its biomechanical scales rippled with colors that shifted between deep blues and greens, and its entire form seemed to flow rather than simply move through space. "They're directing us to Docking Bay 7, Webb reported. "Though they seem concerned about our compatibility with their standard docking procedures." Sarah nodded to her first officer, Commander James Rodriguez. "Show them what we can do." The Nautilus's hull began to shift, the scales realigning themselves as the ship approached the docking bay. What had appeared to be a solid hull suddenly became fluid, the scales flowing and reforming to create a perfect seal with the station's docking ring. The process was beautiful to watch, like water flowing into a container, taking its shape while maintaining its own nature. Inside the station's grand reception hall, the reaction to humanity's first official diplomatic delegation was exactly what Sarah had expected. The assembled alien representatives couldn't seem to decide whether to be horrified or amused by their ship's design. High Chancellor Zix of the Exarillion Collective, a tall crystalline being whose form sparkled with internal light, approached Sarah with what she interpreted as barely concealed disdain. "Captain Chen," the Chancellor's translator conveyed their thoughts in crisp English, "your vessel is most unusual. Perhaps your species has not yet grasped the basic principles of efficient spaceship design." Sarah maintained her diplomatic smile. "We understand the principles perfectly, Chancellor. We simply chose a different approach." "Different?" The Chancellor's crystal form flickered with colors that suggested amusement. "Yes, one might call it that. Tell me, did your engineers perhaps mistake space for an ocean?" Laughter rippled through the gathered diplomats. A Volturi representative, their needle-like form vibrating with mirth, added, "Perhaps they believe they will encounter space whales." Sarah exchanged glances with Rodriguez, who gave her a subtle nod. They had expected this reaction, had planned for it, even. Let them laugh. They didn't know that the Nautilus's biomechanical design allowed it to do things their rigid, crystalline ships could never achieve. They couldn't see how each scale contained quantum computers that could process information faster than their entire fleets combined. They didn't understand that the ship's seemingly primitive design was actually billions of years ahead of their technology, based on principles that nature had perfected long before any of their species had achieved spaceflight. We find that nature often provides the best solutions to complex problems, Sarah replied diplomatically. Evolution has had billions of years to perfect its designs. We simply learned from it. The Chancellor's form sparkled with what might have been condescension. A charming philosophy. However, the Galactic Assembly has established clear guidelines for spacecraft design based on centuries of scientific advancement. Your biological approach seems rather primitive in comparison. Sarah's smile didn't waver. With all due respect, Chancellor, we believe that true advancement comes from thinking beyond established guidelines. The universe is vast and full of surprises. Sometimes, the best way to handle those surprises is to be a little surprising yourself. The gathered diplomats continued their polite mockery, but Sarah remained unfazed. She knew something they didn't, that humanity's primitive approach to spacecraft design was about to save all their lives. The quantum storms were coming, and when they did, these perfect crystalline ships would shatter like glass, while the Nautilus would swim through chaos itself. For now, though, she would let them laugh. The universe had a way of teaching humility to those who needed it most, and Sarah had a feeling that lesson was coming sooner rather than later. Deep within the Nautilus, in a chamber that would have sent the Assembly's engineers into fits of apoplexy, Dr. Maya Patel monitored the ship's quantum neural network. The display before her showed not the rigid diagnostic readouts favored by the Assembly, but rather a flowing, organic representation of the ship's systems. Each scale was represented as a point of light, connecting and flowing with its neighbors in patterns that mimicked the neural networks of Earth's most adaptable creatures. They still don't suspect anything, her assistant, Dr. Chenwei, asked as he analyzed the latest data streams. Maya shook her head, her dark eyes reflecting the flowing patterns of light. They're too convinced of their own technological superiority. They see our biomechanical design as primitive, not understanding that we've achieved what they considered impossible, a truly adaptive spacecraft capable of reading and responding to the quantum fabric of space itself. The display showed the Nautilus's scales adjusting their quantum states in real time, responding to fluctuations in spacetime that the Assembly's sensors couldn't even detect. Each scale was both a sensor and a processor, working in concert to create a ship that was less a machine and more a living entity. The quantum storms are getting stronger, Chen noted, pointing to a pattern in the data. The Assembly sensors will detect them soon. Maya nodded grimly. And when they do, their perfect crystalline ships will be useless. Space isn't rigid and unchanging like their designs. It's fluid, chaotic, alive in its own way. You can't fight chaos with order. You have to adapt to it, flow with it, become part of it. She touched a control, and the display showed the quantum probability waves building at the edge of the system. The storms were coming, and with them, the true test of humanity's approach to space travel. The Assembly would soon learn that their mockery of the Nautilus's design had been premature. Very premature indeed. The first signs of the quantum storm arrived during the Assembly's welcome banquet, while crystalline beings clinked glasses filled with luminescent liquids and needle-shaped vulturi demonstrated their species' famous gravity-defying acrobatics. Dr. Maya Patel's voice cut through Captain Chen's secured comlink with barely contained urgency. Captain, we're detecting massive quantum fluctuations at the edge of the system. The storm we predicted, it's arriving 12 hours ahead of schedule. Sarah maintained her composure as she excused herself from a conversation with 3 Etherian diplomats who had been explaining, in excruciating detail, why their triangular ship design was mathematically perfect. She found a quiet corner of the vast crystalline hall and vocalized her response. How bad? Worse than our models predicted. The probability waves are collapsing in patterns we've never seen before. It's as if. Maya paused, and Sarah could hear the mixture of fear and excitement in her voice. It's as if space itself is coming undone. Before Sarah could respond, the station's ambient lighting shifted from its pleasant golden hue to a deep, pulsing crimson. Warning messages in a dozen alien languages scrolled across the crystalline walls, creating a dizzying kaleidoscope of panic. High Chancellor Zix's crystalline form flickered with colors that Sarah's diplomatic training identified as extreme distress. Impossible. The translator rendered their thoughts in clipped, urgent tones. Our detection grid should have warned us hours ago. What are we dealing with? Sarah demanded, dropping all pretense of diplomatic niceties. The Chancellor's form pulsed with chaotic patterns, a quantum cascade event. Our models suggest it could tear reality apart at the seams. We must evacuate immediately. Around them, the assembled diplomats were already rushing to their ships. The Aetherian vessels were the first to attempt departure, their triangular forms arranging themselves into emergency configurations. They made it barely 1,000 kilometers before the leading edge of the quantum storm hit them. Sarah watched in horror as the mathematically perfect ships began to distort, their carefully calculated angles twisting in ways that should have been impossible. The crystalline vessels of the Ceruleans fared even worse. Their rigid structures couldn't handle the spatial distortions, and hairline fractures began appearing across their hulls. All ships returned to dock. The station's emergency control blared. Standard engines are ineffective against these distortions. Repeat, do not attempt to leave the station. The Nautilus's crew was already in motion before Sarah made it back to the ship. Dr. Patel met her at the airlock, tablet displaying a cascade of flowing data patterns that would have given assembly engineers headaches. Their ships can't handle it, Maya explained as they rushed to the bridge. They designed their vessels to work with space as they thought it should be. Rigid, predictable, mathematically perfect. But space isn't perfect. It's alive, chaotic, constantly changing, just like the oceans back home. Sarah took her place in the command chair, watching through the viewport as more ships attempted to flee, only to be caught in the quantum turbulence. Time to show them why we built our ship the way we did. Status report. Hull scales are already adapting to the quantum fluctuations, Rodriguez reported from his station. Each one is adjusting its molecular structure in real time. We're not just reading the storm, we're becoming part of it. The Nautilus's external cameras showed the approaching storm front. It looked like a wall of shattered reality, space itself cracking and reforming in patterns that hurt the eyes to watch. The station's crystalline structure began to vibrate as the quantum distortions intensified. Station structural integrity at 60% and falling, Lieutenant Webb announced. Their shield generators can't compensate for the spatial distortions. Sarah stood, her decision made. Begin emergency protocols. Maya, activate the quantum mimicry systems. Let's show them what this primitive design can really do. The Nautilus's hull came alive. Each scale began to pulse with its own quantum signature, the colors flowing across the ship's surface like waves in a bioluminescent sea. The biomechanical systems that the assembly had mocked as primitive were about to demonstrate just how advanced they really were. Quantum mimicry engage, Maya reported, her hands dancing across her console. The scales are reading the storm's pattern and matching it. We're not fighting the chaos, we're joining its dance. Through the viewport, Sarah watched as the storm engulfed the station's outer rings. Crystalline structures began to crack, perfect geometric patterns failing against nature's raw power. But the Nautilus held steady, its hull rippling and flowing like liquid metal. Station shield generators are failing. Webb's voice was tense. Structural integrity down to 40%. We've got over 10,000 beings on board who won't survive if those rings collapse. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with steel determination. Launch emergency protocols. Maya, show them what nature can teach us about surviving chaos. The Nautilus's hull began to extend, the scales flowing and reforming into structures that defied conventional physics. Like an anemone extending its tentacles, the ship reached out toward the failing station rings. Where the crystalline structures were cracking under the quantum strain, The Nautilus's biomechanical extensions flowed around them, creating buffer zones where the chaotic space could be temporarily tamed. High Chancellor Zix's voice came through the comm system, their usual condescension replaced by desperate hope. What is your ship doing? Exactly what nature has been doing for billions of years, Sarah replied, watching as the Nautilus's extensions continued to spread, creating a web of stable space around the station. Adapting. Surviving. Evolution didn't perfect rigid, unchanging structures. It perfected the ability to change, to flow, to become one with the chaos instead of fighting against it. The quantum storm raged on, but where the Nautilus's influence spread, the station held. Its biomechanical systems didn't just protect against the spatial distortions. They learned from them, adapted to them, used them. Each scale was a tiny computer, a sensor, and a quantum manipulator all in one, working in concert to turn the storm's chaos into a shield. As the assembled aliens watched in awe, humanity's primitive approach to spacecraft design wasn't just saving their lives. It was rewriting their understanding of what was possible in space. The universe, they were learning, didn't bow to mathematical perfection. It danced with those willing to join its chaos, and humanity had learned to dance very well indeed. As the quantum storm continued to rage around them, the Nautilus's emergency protocols were rewriting everything the Galactic Assembly thought they knew about space travel. In the ship's primary research lab, Dr. Maya Patel found herself surrounded by a group of wide-eyed alien engineers, their previous disdain replaced by desperate curiosity. "Your scales," a Cerulean scientist named Vex asked, their crystalline form vibrating with excitement. "They're not just armor, are they?" Maya smiled as she brought up a holographic display, showing a single scale's internal structure. "They're more like cells in a living organism. Each one can sense, think, and adapt independently, while still working as part of the greater whole." The hologram zoomed in, revealing layers of complexity that made the alien engineers' geometric designs look primitive by comparison. Within each scale, quantum computers operated on principles that mimicked neural networks found in Earth's most adaptable creatures. The scales didn't just protect the ship. They learned, evolved, and changed in response to their environment. "Impossible," an Aetherian engineer whispered, their triangular headplates shifting in patterns of disbelief. "The computational power required. The energy needs alone would be impossible using conventional methods." Maya agreed. "That's why we don't use conventional methods. We let nature do most of the work for us." On the bridge, Captain Sarah Chen watched as the Nautilus continued to stabilize the space around the station. The ship's biomechanical extensions had created a network of stable zones, protected bubbles where the quantum storm's chaos was temporarily tamed. But they were fighting the losing battle. "The storm's getting stronger," Commander Rodriguez reported, his hands dancing across his console. "Our current containment strategy won't hold forever." Sarah nodded grimly. "Maya, time to show them Phase 2. In the research lab, Maya's smile grew wider. "Watch this," she told the assembled engineers as she initiated the next stage of the Nautilus's emergency protocols. The ship's scales began to pulse with new patterns, colors flowing across its surface like waves in a bioluminescent sea. But this time, they weren't just adapting to the quantum chaos. They were learning from it. "Your ship," High Chancellor Zix's voice came through the comm system, their translator struggling to convey their mix of awe and confusion. "It's dancing with the storm." "Not exactly," Sarah replied. "It's learning from it. Evolution didn't teach life to fight against nature. It taught life to become part of nature, to understand it, adapt to it, and eventually to use it." The Nautilus's hull began to shift in ways that should have been impossible, its scales not just flowing but seeming to phase in and out of normal spacetime. The quantum storm's chaos wasn't just being contained anymore. It was being channeled, redirected, transformed. "The fundamental flaw in your approach to space travel," Maya explained to the stunned alien engineers, "was thinking that space is empty and rigid. It's not. It's more like an ocean, full of currents, eddies, and waves that we can't see but can learn to feel. She brought up another display, this one showing the quantum probability waves that their ships couldn't even detect. Your vessels try to punch through space, to impose order on chaos. We designed the Nautilus to swim through it, to feel these currents and use them. The alien engineers watched in fascination as the display showed how each scale could detect and respond to quantum fluctuations that their sensors couldn't even register. The Nautilus wasn't just surviving the storm, it was using the storm's own energy to power its protective field. But the principles of space-time, the Etherian engineer began, are exactly that, principles. Maya interrupted, not laws. Nature doesn't care about our mathematical models or our perfect geometric designs. It cares about what works. And for billions of years, what has worked best isn't rigid resistance to chaos, but adaptive response to it. On the bridge, Sarah watched as the Nautilus's influence spread further, creating a growing zone of stability around the station. The ship's quantum neural network was processing information faster than any conventional computer, each scale contributing to a collective intelligence that was literally learning to speak the language of space-time itself. "We're detecting a change in the storm's pattern," Rodriguez reported. It's like the chaos is starting to flow around us instead of through us." Sarah nodded. This was what they had been working toward, not just survival, but understanding. The Nautilus wasn't fighting the quantum storm anymore. It was becoming one with it, learning its patterns, its rhythms, its dance. In the research lab, Maya continued her impromptu lecture to the increasingly amazed alien engineers. Each scale contains quantum computers based on organic neural patterns. They don't just process information. They experience it, adapt to it, evolve with it. The entire ship is like a living organism, constantly learning and growing. She showed them how the scales could alter their molecular structure in response to spatial distortions, how they could generate localized fields that didn't just deflect quantum chaos, but transformed it into usable energy. "Your ships are tools," she explained. "Beautiful, precise, mathematical tools. But the Nautilus is something else entirely. It's not just a ship, it's an evolution in space travel itself." The assembled engineers watched as the Nautilus continued to rewrite their understanding of what was possible. Their perfect geometric designs, their rigid adherence to established principles, their belief in the supremacy of mathematical order. All of it was being challenged by a ship that dared to learn from nature itself. As the quantum storm raged on, the Nautilus wasn't just protecting the station. It was teaching the galaxy a lesson that humanity had learned long ago, that true advancement doesn't come from imposing our will on the universe, but from learning to dance with its chaos. And in that dance, humanity had become the greatest teachers of all. The emergency council chamber of the Galactic Assembly buzzed with tension as representatives from a dozen species argued over the implications of what they had just witnessed. The Nautilus's demonstration of its capabilities had shaken the very foundations of their technological hierarchy, and not everyone was pleased about it. Supreme Director Nexus of the Volturi technocracy stood before the gathered delegates, their needle-like form vibrating with barely contained fury. "This is unprecedented. These humans hide their true technological capabilities, mock our established protocols, and now expect us to simply accept their superiority." Captain Sarah Chen stood calmly at the speaker's podium, the quantum storm still visible through the chamber's reinforced windows, held at bay by the Nautilus's biomechanical field. "We never claimed superiority, Director. We simply offered a different approach. A different approach that makes our entire defense fleet look obsolete." Nexus's form sparked with dangerous energy, centuries of technological development, rendered meaningless by a species that thinks imitating fish is the height of innovation. High Chancellor Zix's crystalline form pulsed with diplomatic caution. "Perhaps, Director, we should focus on the fact that the human's vessel is currently the only thing preventing the station's complete destruction." The chamber erupted in overlapping arguments. The Etherians were demanding immediate access to the Nautilus's specifications, while the Xerillian scientists were already proposing joint research initiatives. The Vulturi delegation, however, remained ominously silent. In the Nautilus's research lab, Dr. Maya Patel monitored the growing instability in the quantum storm. Something had changed. The chaos wasn't just random anymore. It seemed almost directed. "Captain," she called through the secure channel, "we're detecting unusual patterns in the storm. The probability waves are showing signs of artificial manipulation." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Natural or induced?" "Induced. Someone's trying to amplify the chaos, using our own containment field as a resonator. If they succeed..." Maya's voice trailed off as her screens filled with alarming projections. Back in the council chamber, Supreme Director Nexus continued their tirade. "The humans have violated assembly protocols by concealing their true technological capabilities. Their vessel represents a clear threat to the established order. I move that we impound this ship immediately for detailed study." "Study?" Sarah's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "Or reverse engineering? The Nautilus isn't just technology, Director. It's a philosophy made real. You can't simply take it apart and understand it." "We'll see about that," Nexus replied, their form shifting to reveal hidden energy emitters. "The Vulturi technocracy cannot allow such a disruption to the established technological hierarchy. If you won't surrender your vessel voluntarily." The chamber's lights flickered as multiple energy signatures activated simultaneously. Through the windows, Sarah watched as several Vulturi ships emerged from concealment, their needle-like forms arranging themselves in attack formations. "Captain," Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece, "we're detecting weapons locks from multiple vectors. The Vulturi ships are positioning themselves to use our own containment field against us," Sarah finished. "They think they can overload our systems by feeding energy into the quantum storm." "Maya, they don't understand what they're doing." Maya's voice was tight with concern. "The storm isn't just chaos anymore. It's learning, evolving, using our own adaptations to grow stronger. If they pump more energy into it..." Sarah turned to address the chamber, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of human experience with hubris and its consequences. "Director Nexus, you're about to make a serious mistake. The quantum storm isn't just a natural phenomenon anymore. It's becoming something else entirely." "More human nonsense," Nexus dismissed. "Your primitive biological metaphors won't save you now. The storm is simply quantum chaos, and chaos can be controlled through superior technology." The Vulturi ships opened fire, not at the Nautilus directly, but at carefully calculated points within the quantum storm. They were attempting to create resonance patterns that would overwhelm the biomechanical containment field. What they didn't understand, what their rigid mathematical minds couldn't comprehend, was that they weren't just attacking the ship. They were attacking an adaptive system that had spent the last several hours learning to speak the language of chaos itself. The Nautilus's scales began to pulse with new patterns, colors flowing across its surface in ways that made the observer's eyes hurt. The ship wasn't just containing the storm anymore, it was communicating with it. "Final warning, Director." Sarah's voice was deadly calm. "Stop your attack, or face the consequences of trying to impose order on chaos itself." But the Vulturi ships continued their assault, their energy weapons pumping more and more power into the quantum storm. They believed they could control it, direct it, force it to obey their mathematical models. They were wrong. The storm responded to their attempted control with a surge of chaos that defied all prediction. The Nautilus's scales flashed in synchronized patterns, not fighting the chaos but channeling it, directing it, showing it where to flow. The Vulturi ships, with their perfect geometric forms and rigid technological hierarchy, never stood a chance. One by one, their needle-like vessels began to twist and distort as space itself rejected their attempts at control. Their weapons, their shields, their very forms, all based on the assumption that the universe would bow to mathematical precision, failed spectacularly. In the council chamber, Supreme Director Nexus watched in horror as their fleet was unmade by the very chaos they had tried to weaponize. The Nautilus, meanwhile, continued its dance with the storm, its biomechanical systems adapting and evolving with each passing moment. "You tried to control something that can't be controlled," Sarah told the stunned director. "That's always been the difference between our approaches. You see the universe as something to be dominated through technology. We see it as something to be understood through adaptation." The chamber fell silent as the implications of what they had just witnessed sank in. The Volturi technocracy, long considered one of the most advanced civilizations in the assembly, had just been humbled by a ship that their sensors had initially mistaken for a primitive design. As the quantum storm continued to rage outside, transformed now into something even the Nautilus's systems were struggling to understand, one thing became clear to the gathered representatives. The age of rigid technological hierarchies was over. The era of adaptation had begun. The quantum storm had evolved beyond anything its creators had imagined. What had started as a natural phenomenon, amplified by the Volturi's misguided attempt at control, had become something else entirely. A new form of chaos that learned, adapted, and grew stronger with each passing moment. In the Nautilus's primary research lab, Dr. Maya Patel watched in fascination as her displays showed patterns she had never seen before. The storm wasn't just chaos anymore. It was becoming conscious. "It's using our containment field as a neural network," she explained to Captain Chen and the remaining assembly representatives. "Our biomechanical systems taught it how to think, and the Volturi's attack gave it the energy it needed to evolve." High Chancellor Zix's crystalline form flickered with concern. "Are you saying we're facing an intelligent quantum phenomenon?" "We're facing evolution itself," Sarah replied, watching as the storm continued to grow and change. "This is what happens when you try to impose rigid control on a system designed to adapt and evolve." The remnants of the Volturi fleet had been reduced to twisted shapes that barely resembled their original perfect geometric forms. Supreme Director Nexus stood in silence, their once proud form dimmed with the recognition of their civilization's fundamental error. "The station's structural integrity is failing," Commander Rodriguez reported from his station. "Even with our containment field, we can't hold it together much longer. The storm's learned too much, grown too strong." Sarah turned to Maya. "Options." The scientist's hands danced across her console, bringing up new simulations. "We can't fight it anymore. It's learned all our tricks. But maybe," her eyes lit up with sudden inspiration, "maybe we don't need to fight it at all." She brought up a display showing the Nautilus's neural network, the billions of interconnected scales that made up its adaptive hull. "We've been treating the storm like a threat to be contained, but what if we treat it like what it's become? A new form of life trying to understand itself." "You want to communicate with it?" Chancellor Zix asked incredulously. "With a quantum storm?" "Why not?" Maya smiled. "That's what we designed the Nautilus for, not just to survive chaos, but to understand it. Each scale isn't just a computer or a sensor. It's a translator capable of speaking the language of quantum reality itself." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "We stop trying to control it and start trying to teach it," Maya finished, "just like nature taught us." The captain turned to the assembled representatives. "Clear all ships from the area. We're about to try something that's either brilliant or insane." "Is there a difference?" Rodriguez muttered, but he was already implementing the orders. The Nautilus's hull began to pulse with new patterns, its scales no longer trying to contain or redirect the storm's chaos. Instead, they began to resonate with it, matching its quantum frequencies, synchronizing with its evolved consciousness. "We're not just mimicking it anymore," Maya explained as she monitored the process. "We're showing it how to control itself, using the same principles that let our scales work together as a unified system." Through the viewport, they watched as the storm's chaotic patterns began to shift. The violent, destructive energy started to organize itself, not into the rigid patterns the vulture had tried to impose, but into flowing, organic structures that mimicked the Nautilus's biomechanical systems. "It's learning," Chancellor Zix whispered, their crystalline form reflecting the storm's new patterns. "Just as your ship learned from nature. The storm is learning from us," Sarah finished. "Evolution doesn't stop. It doesn't care about our technological hierarchies or our beliefs about how the universe should work. It only cares about what works." The quantum storm continued to transform, its consciousness expanding as it learned to control its own chaos. The destructive energy that had threatened to tear the station apart began to flow in new patterns, creating structures that defied conventional physics, but followed the organic principles that humanity had discovered. Supreme Director Nexus stepped forward, their form dimmed with humility. "All our attempts to perfect space travel, to impose our will on the universe, we were wrong, weren't we?" "Not wrong," Sarah corrected gently. "Just incomplete. You tried to conquer chaos through order. We learned to dance with it, to understand it, to become part of it. That's humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not superior technology, but a superior way of thinking about technology." The storm's transformation continued, its conscious patterns spreading through space in ways that would rewrite the assembly's understanding of physics. It wasn't just a natural phenomenon anymore, nor was it the weapon the vulture had tried to create. It had become something new, a bridge between order and chaos, between mechanical precision and organic adaptation. "Look," Maya called, pointing to her displays. The storm's patterns had stabilized into something beautiful, a flowing, ever-changing structure that combined the mathematical precision the assembly prized with the adaptive flexibility that humanity had championed. "It's not just surviving," she explained, wonder in her voice. "It's creating. Using principles it learned from our biomechanical systems to reshape space itself." The assembly representatives watched in awe as their sensors registered new phenomena: stable quantum corridors, self-maintaining spatial folds, organic wormholes that defied their rigid understanding of physics. The storm hadn't just learned to control itself. It had learned to improve upon the very fabric of space-time. "This," Sarah addressed the gathered delegates, "is why we built the Nautilus the way we did. Not to prove our superiority or challenge your technological hierarchy, but to show that there's always more to learn. The universe isn't a problem to be solved through perfect equations. It's a dance partner, waiting for someone willing to learn its steps." As the transformed storm continued to create new possibilities for space travel, the assembled representatives of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations finally understood what humanity had been trying to teach them. True advancement didn't come from imposing order on chaos, but from learning to evolve with it, to adapt to it, to become part of it. The Nautilus had shown them the way, not through overwhelming technological superiority, but through the simple wisdom that humanity had learned from Earth's oceans, that the best way to survive chaos is to learn to swim in it. And now, as the conscious quantum storm reshaped their understanding of what was possible, they all became students of evolution once again. The age of rigid hierarchies was over. The era of endless adaptation had begun. And humanity, the species that had dared to learn from nature itself, would lead the way into this new frontier, one adaptive step at a time.